Hi, good morning. This is Nate Teske, and welcome to Sales Stories with Nate Teske. We have a good show today. One of my former colleagues, Joe Gillhaus, is joining us today. And Joe and I last worked together. Believe it or not, it's over 30 years ago now. Time goes by very quickly. But we'll go through some introductions of Joe here in a moment. But just by way of background, I had spent 30 years in the technology sales world, selling services and software, and then later SaaS solutions and services. And looking forward to the discussion here today with Joe about some of his sales stories. Rob, turn it over to you.
All right, I'm your co-host, Rob Sullivan, and well, a little background on me. I started out in advertising, account management, worked at Leo Burnett in Chicago, selling campaigns, that kind of thing. I've approached sales from a variety of different standpoints, executive search, options trading, lots of different things. In the last 18 years or so, I've been doing workshops for sales training, negotiation, leadership, consultative selling, all of that kind of stuff, and a lot of executive coaching and doing ride-alongs in the field with salespeople. So I'm all about the things that we talk about and what happens in the field. The theory is great. I love the classroom, but it's even better to hear what happens, and that's what this whole thing is all about. So thank you, Nate.
Thanks, Rob. Joe, if you could give a little bit about your background, then we'll start our discussion here today.
Sure. Thanks, Nate. Rob, thank you for transitioning over. My name is Joe Gillhaus, as Nate mentioned. We worked together about 30 years ago when we first started out at ADP, Automatic Data Processing. So I did spend the majority of my career at ADP, about 29 years in total, progressing through small business, major accounts, and our enterprise and global enterprise solutions. So both in individual contributor roles and leadership roles. And more recently, I've made the transition to a Workday partner called OneSource Virtual, where we're kind of adjacent to the ADP story with services that we provide, but we're exclusive with Workday. And it's been kind of a fun ride and a nice transition for me here over the last 2.5 years.
Right on, Joe. Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, Joe, when we reconnected a few weeks ago, we had talked and it was literally 30 years since we last spoke humanly, right? We connected on LinkedIn and communicated on that and such. But, I kind of call that the children years. If you have kids, it's a couple of decades, which just goes by like that, where it's somewhat all consuming. Plus you're working and, doing your hobbies and hanging with pals and stuff whenever you can. But crazy how fast time goes by, but also how fast you kind of sink back into where we were those years ago, right? Cutting our teeth and learning about the sales game. So with that being said, Joe, love to hear your perspective on one of your best sales stories, and it doesn't have to be just one, but something that really sticks out in your mind as far as something in your career that was like, wow, this is something I'll remember kind of forever. Love to hear your perspective on that story, and also that just the whole transaction, the deal, details, etc.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Nate. Obviously over my career, I've had a number of wins, number of losses as well, right? And sometimes you learn just as much from either one of those. But one of the better ones that I had that came to mind was an organization here in the northern suburbs of Chicago, the debt collector organization. A former client of mine of ADP, and they were about 3,000 employees or so, and they left for a competitor. And this was one of those ones where you're trying to get back in, you're trying to tell a different story, a differentiating story to try to get them to take those calls and maybe be able to nudge this one along. And it was getting more and more difficult, right? I mean, this is when call it 15, 20 years ago, when a lot of times it was a certain feature or two or a couple of dollars in savings might be able to nudge someone along. But it was becoming more and more of a challenge for organizations to justify that type of switch, right? For a few dollars or maybe a few features. And so we really had to think outside of the box, like what is a differentiator? What are some game changers that we can help this organization with that would make us different, that would move the needle for them to reconsider coming back. And one of the things that we did is we learned that the organization, and some of our homework, was recently acquired by private equity. And we also learned that the goals for the organization was rapid growth from an acquisition standpoint. And as we learned more about that and what their goals were, we started talking about headcounts and what does that look like in our world, payroll and HR, as you rapidly acquire, and what are the systems going to look like as you journey down those paths of bolting on another 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 employees. The more that we learned is they really didn't have a plan there yet. they figured that they would be able to manage that internally and add headcount accordingly. And so, I introduced a new path for them around, what we called at the time managed payroll services, managed outsourcing services, where it wasn't about the technology. This was more about us improving the processes and building a solution that was scalable from a people and process standpoint, that as they grew, we would grow right alongside of them without the added headcount and risk to the organization. So it opened up their eyes, right? They said, well, hey, let's learn more about this, because, we haven't thought about it that way, right? And, as we started modeling things out and, doing some ROIs of what it would cost to add additional people, a person per 1,000 people approximately in payroll and HR. And, we started to quickly realize that the ROI was significant, that this solution can scale with them. It's a difference maker, and is something that can help them with their trajectory and reduce the risk, right? Because we all know when there's acquisitions involved and there's bolt-ons and there's cultural changes and all those things that come along with growing, at that type of speed and size, there's a lot of business risk, right? And execution. And this was a very low risk solution that we can scale with them. So it became apparent that this was a differentiator, and it was something that was going to move the needle for them. We also, on the flip side, brought in kind of the thought of, what is the cost of inaction, right? Because sometimes I think, we just think of like, hey, this is our solution. This is what we can solve for. This is the ROI. But we've all lost deals too, right? Because maybe we didn't go back and pause and say, hey, if you don't do something like this, what is that going to cost you? What are the risks there, right? So you're kind of doing that plus or minus here. Let's go through all sides, not just our solution, but the cost of not doing anything. And, that was an eye opener for them as well, right? Because we started painting out those risks. We started painting out what is the risk of an acquisition becoming a problem, right? For onboarding employees and merging systems and not having payroll go out on time or accurately because of processes that weren't thought through, right? Then you can lose employees, you can have higher turnover, you can have compliance risk. So we started modeling that out. And that's when, this got speed and, brought us right to the CFO's table to say, hey, this is something that we have an answer for our, private equity friends, that we have a scalable solution. So when they tell us it's time to go on an acquisition, we're ready to go. We don't have to worry about the back office being a problem that would slow down the PE firm's, desires in terms of growth. So it was a really fun process. I mean, again, going back to the beginning, when we're talking technology to technology, at that scale, we might have been talking, $300,000 or $400,000 annual deals here, and maybe you save them a few dollars, maybe a few more features. This became, a $1.2 million spend at their current, size, and would only grow from there. But again, the cost of adding additional headcounts and people in payroll and HR and benefits to support that growth well exceeded that 1.2 from an investment standpoint. It was kind of a fun one, right? Because, you're taking this one from ground zero and thinking about what are our different angles. What can I learn about this organization more than just, hey, we've got some new features or we could save you some money. And then we built our case and our story around that. And it was fun to bring payroll and HR on board at first and get them excited. And then once the light bulbs went off there, you're walking into the CFO's office with a really tight story, because payroll and benefits, they now want you to win, right? Because they know if they don't do this, their cost of inaction is, holy cow, how are we going to manage this growth with the current system, right? It's only going to put more pressure on us. And if we could partner with this type of solution, boy, this is a win for us personally and professionally. Let's get you the best data we need to help you in that CFO conversation. So it was fun. Closing that deal was a lot of fun. It was the gift that kept giving in a way, because every time they acquired another organization, right, I got that phone call, said, hey, what kind of change order do we need to do? We added another 1,500 people, another 2,000. And so that was one of those deals that you guys are probably well aware of, right? That spans years and can be difference maker, with your career and your role. So that's the one that I was thinking of. And it was a fun deal to win.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's funny when you get a deal like that, I wouldn't say it's a surprise to yourself, but you're like, wow, I can't believe we got it, right? In some ways. And then on top of that, since you did a good job with the business case and everything and getting those HR people on board, it was very easy for them to continue to expand because you were doing a good job for them,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
And one question I have on that is as you were going through and building that ROI and business case, did those HR execs, did they give you, like, help you kind of model that and build it around their, I guess, decision criteria or requirements?
They did. That's where it got fun because I think once we got past the initial stages of what this could look like, where the savings potentially could be, how this scales and can make their life easier, they were much more open with, hey, let me get you some of those numbers. Let me get you the cost, the salary, the full burden with benefits and so forth of these 3 payroll people and these 3 HR people. And hey, maybe you can put it into your spreadsheet and really kind of, take a look at it and break it out as to where the savings might be. So that was the fun part because a lot of times those folks hold that information close to their vest, right? They almost sometimes get a little suspicious and don't want you to have too much information because then you could kind of move the numbers the way you need to try to make a deal work. But these guys knew that hey, we were working in their best interest, and this was going to help them with this oncoming slaughter of growth that they needed an answer for, and they knew that we had the right solution for.
Yeah, the best part of that for me, as you were telling it, was hearing about how you helped change their requirements by getting them to think about the solution differently and bringing that to the table. And also, secondly, that whole idea of what's the risk of not doing anything, because that to me, that's such a key question. And I often coach people to ask that because it does make a huge difference in terms of how people are thinking, because sometimes they are literally not thinking that. And I've asked it myself where I've seen people just get terror in their eyes and say, well, that's just the thing. If I don't do something, I'm not going to have a business next year.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of those things, like think of, in our worlds and careers, I feel like in a lot of cases, there were many situations that we didn't lose to a competitor. The number one loss was right to no decision.
Yep.
And right, so that cost of inaction, the value wasn't built enough there. And sometimes I think sales folks are afraid to kind of ask that question, like, because maybe they don't have enough of a business case to overcome that objection, right? So, that's one of those things that you learn from experience. Like you've got to build that, build that case of, hey, if you don't do this, and be confident and have the numbers to back it. If you don't do this, look at what it's going to cost you. Right? Half of the times when we lose to that no decision. They just didn't feel enough of that pain, and there was that cost of inaction.
Yeah, it reminds me of, and we all know this because we're all of age. It reminds me of Wayne's World. We fear change.
Yeah.
It was SNL, then it became a film from Aurora, Illinois. But when I jotted a note when you were talking about that, and my note was IBM. Years ago, people used to say, "Well, you never get fired for staying with IBM." That used to be kind of the old term. Well, fast forward, that ain't the case anymore. But it's interesting too, because that no decision, as you said, Joe, that in most cases, that's your competition, right? Because you're going in with something new, whatever it is, and you have to build that business case around it, which you very wisely did with that particular company, where you had them in the boat rowing with you. My wife and I recently watched the Viking show and then the Vikings Valhalla, and they're in the boat rowing with you, right? When you have their team in the boat rowing with you,
Mm-hmm.
and you're building the business case and they're on board with it, they're helping you package it up and everything. When you get to the CFO, you've already laid all the groundwork, and internally, knowing that those HR people were on board with your deal, in my opinion, they're behind the scenes talking to those executives up to the CFO. So when you go in, you're more so just validating what they've already shared internally, because so many behind the scenes discussions happen that you and I as salespeople just never know, right? You don't know what's happening behind the scenes.
That's right.
And in an interview we did with one of our former colleagues, Tim, yesterday, he was talking about a deal that he did with a very large customer, where it's multi-million-dollar deal. And after it was all said and done, they're now married. They signed the contract. They were at an event with that customer, and the main contact he had went up to Tim and said, "Hey, just so you know, Tim, you guys were our choice from the start. We knew out of the gate we're going with you." And it reminded me of Wedding Singer when Adam Sandler says to his now ex-fiance, "Hey, that would have been great information to have yesterday before the wedding." But it was kind of funny because he said he didn't know that until she said that. And he said, wow, he goes, that's awesome to hear. But, when you're in the trenches like that, you're just working that deal to, until it's done, obviously. But one other thing I wanted to mention too was you talked about private equity getting involved. And for those listening, if you've never dealt with customers that have a private equity owner, it's a very interesting dynamic because the private equity company team, whatever they tell that client to do, they do it. I've benefited from it in my career where private equity comes in, takes over a particular company, and that particular company, or that private equity company, I should say, is already working with the service or product that you're selling. They come in and say, hey, call Nate and engage with him and get this done. Those deals go like that, right? So private equity companies have a tremendous amount of control. And their number one concern, their two concerns is cutting costs and increasing revenue. It's that simple, right? Whether it's reducing headcount or making things more efficient. So you had a 1-2 punch, right? You came in more at a better cost and made things more efficient at the same time. And that's Valhalla to the private equity people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have a question too on this one because obviously you did a lot of things right and everything came together to make that happen. I'm curious what the milestones or signposts earlier in your career were that led you to do those things right. Because a lot of times I feel like we have to make the mistakes in order to say, okay, on this deal, that's never going to happen again. We're going to do it this way. So what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think after a number of rounds of trying to go head to head against an incumbent that, there wasn't much of a differentiator, right? And you're talking feature to feature and you're trying to lower their cost. You certainly win a number of those, right? And you certainly have enough coaches or there's a little bit of pain with their current provider and you're able to win those deals. But I think on the flip side, the more that you lost those deals and you digested like, why did I lose? Did I really even have a deal here? And you start realizing that, hey, you need more, right? You can't go feature for feature and a few items against, the competitors and expect to win, right? It's just the game is changing. Like in the past, if you saved them 20%, maybe they were willing to go through a change, right? But as the switchovers in our world, for HR and payroll became more and more complicated and more complex, and they weren't just a 6-week implementation. They were more 12-week or 16. People had skin in the game at the client and they needed to really justify it. And as there became more buyers at the client, right, they had to justify up 2 or 3 different levels to get a deal done versus I feel like early in my career, sometimes you can get, 1 or 2 people involved to make a decision, right? And I think as the price tags got bigger and as just things got more complicated, there was more people making that decision at a client, and you had to have a more robust answer for that. And it just made you really rethink the process. Like, how do we win? How do we differentiate? What's going to move the needle? And you've got to come in with different. Otherwise, you're going to get those no decisions on a more regular basis. And you hear too many of those. And that's when people make career changes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the risk of making a mistake to save a couple of percent is often a lot bigger than the benefit of making the move. So
that's right.
There's no point.
That's right. That's right. And, for a time being, we had kind of really the only solution on the market that provided that level of white glove service. And so it was one of our fastest growing centers of services. And if you were smart about it and you knew how to build that case, this became an extremely profitable part of your selling bag, so to speak, right? I mean, if you can do this and do it well and you had confidence around it, it was well worth it. Versus, kind of the older school method of, hey, I'm going to go head to head, knuckle to knuckle against the, incumbent and, try to beat them on a few features and try to get my coach to help sell the deal because they really like us. And, that kind of went by the wayside over the last 10, 15 years.
And you're right. There's a lot more people involved. It seems like every year the research shows that there's 6 to 8 or more involved in a B2B buying decision.
That's true. Very true.
Yeah, Joe, that deal you were talking about, the debt recovery company, like from a start to finish, how long was your sales cycle? And then kind of along the same lines, did you have like regular recurring calls with that customer as you went through the sales engagement? I'm just curious kind of how you managed that and how long the engagement took.
Yeah, this one was approximately 6 months. And I think, early on we identified that there was a window of opportunity in that 6 to 9 months because they were up for renewal. So, they were somewhat motivated that if this solution sounds as good as what they think it is, that they want to move this along at a regular cadence, right? Because they're starting to get hit up from the existing vendor and wanting to know, does the renewal look good? What should we add? What shouldn't we? So they had both sides kind of pushing them along and pushing this motion to help support the motion overall. So, again, I'd say it's probably 6 to 9 months in total, but after the first probably 6 to 8 weeks, it really gained steam. And it wasn't about me pushing for the next meeting or pushing for the next cadence call. It was them, which was refreshing, right? They're like, hey, we've got this information. We've got an upcoming leadership meeting. I'd like to present X, Y, and Z. Can you get me more detail? And can we talk next Wednesday before we go into that leadership call on Friday? And you're like, wow, I like this, right? Like now you've got someone that was really kind of suspicious to they kind of like this idea to, wow, help us get this information in the right hands to help us build our case internally. And by the way, Joe, can you meet next Friday? And then 2 weeks from this Friday. And so that was a great evolution once we started those wheels in motion.
Well, they clearly saw the value.
Yeah, that is the best scenario when the client has, what they call an impending event or a compelling event. And you don't have to manufacture it or make one up or, create it or whatever based on your fiscal year or something like that. But that's awesome when they're pushing you to meet, because when you have that scenario, that's when you're in the, the catbird seat, right?
Yep.
Where they want to get, because not only the other thing too that I found is they're invested, right? It took 6 to 9 months. Well, that's 6 to 9 months of their time they could have been spending on another project, right? Because that's the one thing that I think a lot of salespeople, myself included, struggle with is you think you're, the most important thing to them, right? But you're not. You have to make it very, very easy for them to engage and, help build a business case and things like that. And once you get kind of that over that hurdle of getting them on board, as I said, rowing with you, that's the ultimate, right? Because then it's just getting through all the tactical pieces and things like that. Kind of along those same lines, I'm just curious, did you have any internal struggles with respect to that opportunity? Meaning, was the internal sale, I don't want to say easy, but equivalent, or was it harder than the sale with the customer?
Internal on our side?
Yeah, within the company, right.
Yeah, I don't, within the ADP side, as us being the vendor.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think there was too much of a struggle. I mean, there were some points of, can we deliver on certain things because there were certain processes within payroll and benefits that were, not standardized, that we would have to build a few things, to make it fit within our box. But no, I think when everybody on our side realized the opportunity here, right? When you not only talk about, hey, this is a, 3,000, 4,000 employee company and they're going to stay like that for a while. But when you start painting the picture internally with your stakeholders as well of, hey, this has got legs to where this is 3,000 employees now, it's going to be 10 or 15 in 4 years. Like that's when you start raising some eyes internally, if I needed things along pricing or enablement fees, or I needed someone to fly on site to help with, the demonstration and so forth. Like there was a lot of good engagement on our side when everybody understood the big picture of what this revenue opportunity could look like. I think sometimes, it's a little harder when you're just dealing with, hey, this is 3,000 employees, here's the dollar amount, and I need everybody's hands on deck and I need these pricing concessions. A little more difficult, right? But when you paint a bigger picture, we had everybody rowing in the same direction pretty quickly.
Yeah, and along those lines, did you have like internally within your team, did you have an executive sponsor that was kind of not necessarily on all the calls, but on maybe status calls or maybe a summary call or something like that? Did you have a strong executive sponsor internally that you were leveraging? Because sometimes I kind of call it a buffer in between, your deal and then senior management about, hey, they got to close this, Nate needs to close this on by the end of the quarter type thing. And then you have a manager in between or executive in between who helps manage that. Did you have a strong exec sponsor on your side who was kind of in lockstep with everything from a strategy standpoint?
Yeah, good call out. We got our general manager involved right from the get-go. So once this started building momentum, we actually invited them out to our facility for a tour. So to kind of make them feel comfortable with what goes on behind the scenes, to meet our client service team, to meet our enablement team, to meet our general manager, right? And to feel comfortable with, the support team and what it's going to look like after the sale. Because I think that's important, right? Because, we're there to really sell the solution and what we can deliver and what we can bring to the table. But a lot of times people want to think, well, that's great and that's flashy and that's new and that sounds great, but what is it going to look like when you turn me over, so to speak, right? And so that was a key part of our process. And at the same time, we built that connection with their executive team to our general manager. So they then had, some side conversations after our call, thanking them for that opportunity. Hey, where can I assist? There weren't many of those calls that took place, but there were some. So I knew that if I needed to lean on, hey, this is paused or this is stalled. Hey, Mr. GM, can you maybe reach to your contact and just kind of say, hey, where are things at? We had some really good discussions. Everything sounded very, positive in terms of moving forward. What can we do to help? So we didn't really necessarily need that very often, but it was good to have that connection established, again, if needed, right? Because sometimes our opportunities, they go quiet, they go dark. You don't know why. All of a sudden there's lack of communication, right? The old saying of if they're not talking to us, they're talking to someone else, right? And so when that happens, if you don't have that exec alignment, you really don't have anywhere to go, right? I mean, how many times can you call them and can you email them, right, with nothing coming back? So it's a key component, I think, in every opportunity to have that alignment. If you can get it early, right? If you have enough of a reason to bring them in and the opportunity is progressing and you feel like there's a reason or a value to bring to them to involve your team, right? To show them what it would look like after the sale. So that was a great point, Nate, to bring up.
Yeah, and I found too, in a lot of ways, clients expect it, right? It's somewhat of a, I don't know if I would say an ego stroke. It's more so if there is an issue, because at some point you're going to have a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something's going to come up, something's going to get squirrely. And so long as they have a direct channel to that executive you bring along, whether it's a general manager, your VP or whomever, things happen, right? Because there's humans involved, there's errors, there's issues that come up. But knowing they have that, I don't want to say that one throat to choke, but in some ways that one throat to choke, right? Where, they
Right.
come back and say, hey, you told us this is what was going to be the situation. So that was the one piece of it. But secondarily, and from a sales standpoint, my opinion of it is when you have those executives involved, if for whatever reason that deal does not come through and happen, they can't say, hey, Nate, you screwed up. You could say, well, you were working the deal with me. What did
Right.
we do wrong, right? Which is kind of a wink, wink thing. But in all seriousness, the thing I like about doing that is besides the clients expecting it, it also gives you an opportunity to escalate internally, right? Because that general manager, if there's something, as Tim was talking about yesterday, it's just fresh in my head because we just talked about it. He said there was one final contract issue, which in the grand scheme was nothing, but it was something that the company was not able to do from a policy standpoint. So he said he called his executive and said, look, this is it. This is the last thing we have to do. And it's never going to come up in the deal. It's such an ancillary thing. It's kind of a non-issue from his perspective. And when it was all said and done, they push it through. But if you don't have that executive involved, they're going to say, well, hold on, I don't know anything about this account. Tell me what's going on. And then you have to, when I talk about the internal sale, then you have to internally sell it. And if you do that early enough, you already have the eyes on that particular deal. So they know, like you said, right? Hey, this is where they're at today. They're 3,000 employees. They're going to go to 10 to 12,000 in 4 years or whatever the time frame was. So when you have that visibility, I think only good things happen when you have everyone in the organization on board with it.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you brought that up because I was thinking about that same deal too while he was talking. And it's interesting to me how, like Joe, in your case, you got every indication from them that they were on board. They're asking you for meetings where, in the other case that we were talking about, it was interesting because there was even a call on, I think it was New Year's Eve where they said, oh yeah, deal's off. And it was a few days before that. And then I think it all came back together. But there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of questioning. Is this really going to happen? And with your deal, it seems like you never really got that sense because they were so clearly on board from a very early point. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it was. And I think what we also built into this as well is, again, when you're trying to take it from a competitor and the incumbent, so to speak, you always worry about what is that incumbent going to come back with to try to retain the business, right? I think that crossed our mind early on, but I think we were so confident in the fact that our solution was a completely different model, right? That we built ourselves into a spot where we didn't really have to worry about the incumbent saying, hey, we'll reduce it by 30% to, all of a sudden New Year's Eve, get that note that says, hey, we're going to stay with who we have. So that, that was kind of a by design, right? Because we knew the only way we were going to win this is if we offered that differentiator, which we did. And then we knew that we were going to protect ourselves because we weren't going to get that surprise phone call that said, hey, they just, they kept the business. They lowered the price, which is, good angle to, again, build and fortify your position and knowing that you're not going to get that surprise at the end. Now, procurement came in at the end and they wanted their pint of blood like they always do, right? But I think, again, we pointed back to the business case and the ROI, and it was so strong from what we're going to deliver to them, to their bottom line, that we didn't have to move much. It's not like we needed to go back and make all kinds of concessions and months for free or quarters for free or reducing enablement, because our case was really strong. And that doesn't happen very often when you're at the finish line with procurement, right? They're going to get their piece, and that's why they're there, rightfully so. But we had a really good story.
Yeah.